In 1868, the Hayward Fault tore the ground open for 20 miles, and geologists traced that break north to the place where it ended at a town called San Leandro. On Thursday morning, at 8:30, an earthquake struck 2.5 miles from San Leandro. Same fault. It was small, magnitude 3.8, no damage, no injuries, trains running normally again before lunch. But that fault is 157 years and 10 months into a cycle that averages 161 years. It runs directly beneath 2 million people. And the one thing about it that looks reassuring is the exact reason it breaks as often as it does. This fault moves every single day. Almost everyone has that backwards. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Let's get into it. Part 1. The morning it moved. At 8:30 in the morning, Pacific time on Thursday the 13th of August 2026, the ground underneath the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay moved about 5 kilometers below the surface, and roughly 2.5 million people found out about it at the same instant. It was not a rolling motion. People who live in earthquake country learn to distinguish between the two, and the distinction matters more than most of them realize. A distant large earthquake arrives as a slow swell, a sensation more like being on water than being on land, because the high-frequency energy has been stripped out of the waves by the hundreds of kilometers they traveled to reach you. What happened Thursday morning was the opposite. It was a single sharp jolt, over almost before the brain had time to categorize it. The kind of shock that sounds like a truck hitting the side of the building. That signature tells you something specific before any agency has published a single number. It tells you the source was small, and it tells you the source was close. Both of those things turned out to be true. The United States Geological Survey placed the epicenter about 2.5 miles from San Leandro, California, at a depth of roughly 3.2 miles, which is about 5.2 kilometers. Those first location bulletins described the position relative to San Leandro in slightly different directions during the first hour, which happens routinely as automated solutions get refined. When the dot was finally plotted on a map, it landed inside the city limits of Oakland, up in the hills, close to the Oakland Zoo. People near the zoo reported the strongest shaking of anyone. People across the water in San Francisco felt it as a quick, unmistakable bump. There was no damage. There were no injuries. In the ordinary accounting of what makes an earthquake newsworthy, this event should have been forgotten by lunch. It was not, and the reason has nothing to do with how big it was. The earthquake occurred on the Hayward Fault. If you have spent any time reading about seismic hazard in the United States, that sentence carries a weight that has nothing to do with Thursday morning. The Hayward Fault is not a remote structure running through empty desert or sitting 100 miles offshore. It runs along the base of the East Bay Hills, threading north to south through Richmond, Berkeley, Oakland, San Leandro, Hayward, Union City and Fremont, underneath houses and schools and hospitals and freeway interchanges and water lines and rail tunnels. It is one of the most densely instrumented faults on the planet, and it is very likely the single most studied earthquake source in North America. And here is the fact that turns an unremarkable Thursday morning into something worth 2 hours of your attention. The last time the Hayward Fault produced a major earthquake was the 21st of October, 1868. That rupture broke the surface of the ground, and geologists were able to trace the crack for about 20 miles, from the Warm Springs district of what is now Fremont in the south, north, to a place where the visible break ended. That place was San Leandro. Thursday morning's earthquake happened within a couple of miles of the northern end of the last great rupture on this fault. That is not a prediction. It is not evidence of anything on its own, and anyone who tells you otherwise is getting ahead of the data. Small earthquakes happen on the Hayward Fault constantly, along every part of it, and the overwhelming majority of them are followed by nothing at all. But the geographic coincidence is exact, and it is the reason this particular magnitude 3.8 is worth stopping to look at when 1,000 others were not. Because the 1868 earthquake was not a minor event. It killed 30 people in a region that held roughly 260,000 at the time. In the town of Hayward, which had a population of about 500, nearly every single building was either destroyed outright or damaged so badly it had to come down. The adobe church at Mission San Jose collapsed. Before 1906 came along and took the title, that earthquake was known simply as the Great San Francisco Earthquake, and the United States Geological Survey still describes it as one of the most destructive in the recorded history of California. The Bay Area now holds somewhere in the neighborhood of 7.7 million people. That is roughly 30 times the exposure of 1868, sitting on top of the same fault, waiting on the same clock. And the clock is the part that will stay with you. Geologists have dug trenches across the Hayward Fault and read the layered record of its past ruptures the way you would read tree rings. From that record, a team led by James Lean Kemper published an estimate of how often this fault produces an earthquake, like the one in 1868. The number they arrived at was 161 years, give or take 65 years at one standard deviation. The individual intervals they could measure range from as little as 95 years to as much as 183 years. As of this month, the elapsed time since the 1868 rupture is 157 years and 10 months. Sit with that arithmetic for a moment, because it is going to structure everything that follows. The fault is not overdue in the sense that it has blown past a deadline. It is sitting almost exactly on the mean, inside the window, in the part of the distribution where the outcome is genuinely uncertain and genuinely near. If the interval this time runs short, we are already past due. If it runs long, there could be another 25 years in it. There is no version of the data that lets you rule either of those out. Now here is where I want to be careful with you, because there is an easy version of this video and an honest one, and they are not the same. The easy version says a magnitude 3.8 struck the most overdue fault in America, and the big one is coming. That version is wrong, and it is wrong in a way that matters. A magnitude 3.8 on the Hayward Fault does not tell us that a magnitude 7 is imminent. It does not shorten the fuse. It does not represent stress being released in any quantity that changes the calculation, and I will show you exactly how small a fraction it represents later on, because the number is genuinely absurd. The honest version is stranger, and, I think, considerably more unsettling. The hazard on this fault did not change on Thursday morning. It has been elevated continuously for decades. It was elevated last Tuesday. It was elevated last year. It will be elevated next spring, whether or not the ground moves again in the meantime. Nothing that happened at 8:30 in the morning altered the physical state of the Hayward Fault in any way a seismologist could measure. What changed was attention. For a few hours on a Thursday, several million people who live directly on top of one of the best documented catastrophes in waiting, anywhere on Earth, were briefly, involuntarily reminded of that fact. And then the train started running at normal speed again, and the news moved on. That gap between a hazard that is constant and an attention span that spikes for a morning and decays by dinner is the actual subject of this video. The earthquake is the doorway. What is on the other side of it is a much harder question about a region that knows precisely what is going to happen to it, has known for a very long time, has quantified it down to the individual building, and has not been able to make that knowledge change very much of anything. There is one more thing worth knowing about how an event like this gets characterized, because it involves the public directly, and most people have no idea they are part of the instrument. Magnitude describes the earthquake at its source, one number for the whole event, regardless of where you are standing. Intensity describes the shaking at a particular place, and it varies enormously across a region depending on distance, depth, and the ground beneath your feet. The two are routinely confused, and they answer entirely different questions. Magnitude asks how big was it? Intensity asks how bad was it here? Intensity is measured on a descriptive scale built from what people and structures actually experienced, barely perceptible at the low end, through dishes rattling and hanging objects swinging in the middle range, up to structural damage at the top, and the Geological Survey collects it by asking. Anyone who felt an earthquake can file a report describing what they experienced and where, and those reports get aggregated by location into a map of shaking intensity that often has finer spatial resolution than the seismometer network can provide, simply because there are far more people than instruments. On Thursday morning, that map filled in across the entire Bay Area within minutes. Sharp shaking clustered tightly around the Oakland hills near the epicenter, weakening outward, with a scatter of reports from across the water in San Francisco, where people described a brief, distinct jolt. It is a portrait of a small, shallow earthquake assembled by several thousand strangers, and it is one of the more genuinely collaborative things in modern science. It also produced for a few minutes on a Thursday morning a live map of exactly which parts of the Bay Area sit on ground that amplifies shaking, which is the same map that will matter enormously on a day when the fault does something considerably larger than this. But before we get to any of that, there is a smaller mystery to clear up, and it is the one that filled comment sections all morning, because the earthquake did not stay a magnitude 4.1. Part 2, the number that kept getting smaller. The first number the Geological Survey published was 4.1. Within about an hour, that number had become 3.9, and then shortly after it became 3.8, which is where it sits now. 2 revisions, both downward, both inside the first hour, on an event that several million people had personally felt. You can predict the reaction without looking, and you would be right. They downgraded it. They are covering something up. They do not want people to panic. That interpretation appeared almost immediately, and it appears every single time this happens, which is to say constantly, because magnitude revisions are among the most ordinary things that occur in seismology. So let me walk you through what actually happens between the moment the ground moves and the moment a number appears on a website, because once you understand the mechanics, the conspiracy version stops being available. When a fault slips, it radiates energy outward as waves. The fastest of those waves is called the P wave, a compressional pulse that travels through rock at roughly 6 kilometers per second. It is followed by the slower and more destructive S wave. Seismometers scattered across Northern California register the P wave arrival first, and the moment enough stations have registered it, an automated system goes to work. It has to. Speed is the entire point. Earthquake early warning systems live or die on whether they can push an alert to a phone before the damaging waves arrive, and that means the first magnitude estimate has to be computed by machines, from a handful of stations in a matter of seconds. An estimate made in seconds from partial data is an estimate with real uncertainty attached to it. The algorithm is looking at the first fraction of the waveform before the rupture is even finished and extrapolating. It is very good. It is not perfect, and it was never designed to be perfect. It was designed to be fast. Then the rest of the data arrives. More stations report. The full waveform becomes available rather than just its opening moments. A human analyst reviews the solution, checks the station pics, discards bad readings, and computes a reviewed magnitude using the complete picture. That reviewed number replaces the automated one. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. On Thursday morning it went down, twice, by a total of 3/10 of a magnitude unit. 3/10 sounds trivial. In energy terms, it is not nothing. The magnitude scale is logarithmic, and a drop from 4.1 to 3.8 corresponds to roughly a factor of 2.8 in radiated energy. The earthquake released about a third as much energy as the first automated estimate suggested. But here is the part that dismantles the cover-up reading entirely. The Geological Survey revises magnitudes on earthquakes that nobody is watching. It revises them for events in the middle of the Pacific, in unpopulated Alaska, under Antarctic ice, where there is no public to reassure and no panic to prevent. The procedure is identical. It is the same automated pipeline followed by the same analyst review, running on thousands of events a year, the vast majority of which no human being ever feels. And consider the logic of the accusation for a second. If an agency wanted to suppress alarm about an earthquake that 2.5 million people had just physically experienced, publishing a magnitude at all would be a strange way to go about it. Publishing one, then publicly correcting it downward twice in full view, would be stranger still. Cover-ups do not usually come with a revision history. What actually deserves scrutiny here is not the agency. It is what the revision does to us. A number that goes down reads instinctively as a de-escalation. Smaller than they said, less than we thought, false alarm, and in almost every case that instinct is a reasonable one, because for most earthquakes magnitude really is the story. A magnitude 3.8 in most places on Earth is a curiosity and nothing more. This is one of the places where that instinct fails, because the magnitude was never the story here. The location was, and the location did not get revised. The epicenter did not move away from the Hayward Fault when the number came down. It did not drift away from the northern end of the 1868 rupture. A magnitude 3.8 2.5 miles from San Leandro and a magnitude 4.1 2.5 miles from San Leandro carry precisely the same information about the fault underneath, which is that the fault is there, it is loaded, and it is doing what a loaded fault does. There is one more piece of this worth understanding, because it explains why the first number came in high rather than low, and the answer is not random. The automated systems that produce those first magnitudes are tuned deliberately towards speed and toward not missing anything. In the design trade-offs of an early warning system, the cost of underestimating an earthquake is much higher than the cost of overestimating one. If the system undercalls a magnitude 7 as a magnitude 5, people who needed a warning do not get one, and that failure has a body count attached to it. If the system overcalls a magnitude 3.8 as a magnitude 4.1, a few people get a slightly more dramatic alert than the situation warranted, and they roll their eyes. Those two failure modes are not remotely equivalent, and the system is built accordingly. It leans toward the loud error. So the pattern we saw Thursday morning is close to the expected behavior of a correctly functioning system. A fast, slightly high first estimate, followed by a slower, more accurate revision downward. The revision was not the correction of a mistake. The revision was the second half of a process that was working exactly as designed. And the first half of that process is the reason people in Northern California get seconds of warning at all. What all of this means is that the number on the screen was never the interesting quantity. It moved because measurement moved. The thing being measured did not move at all. It is also worth knowing what a magnitude actually measures, because the number is more concrete than most people assume. Modern magnitudes are moment magnitudes, and seismic moment is the product of three physical quantities: the rigidity of the rock, the area of the fault surface that slipped, and the average distance it slipped. Multiply those together, and you get a number describing the total work the earthquake did. The magnitude scale is a compressed logarithmic expression of that quantity, designed so that the numbers stay conveniently small, which means a magnitude 3.8 is not an abstraction. It is a description of a patch of the Hayward Fault, probably a few hundred meters across, sliding by something on the order of a couple of centimeters. That is the entire event. A patch smaller than a city block, moving less than the width of your hand, 5 kilometers under the Oakland hills, and 2.5 million people felt it. Scale that up, and the 1868 event becomes easier to picture. 32 kilometers of fault, rupturing through the full seismogenic depth, slipping by a meter or more, not a patch. A sheet of rock the size of a small county letting go at once. The revision made the earthquake feel smaller. It did not make the fault any safer. Those are entirely different statements, and the ease with which we slide from one to the other is worth noticing about ourselves. And there is a reason to hold that thought, because within 37 minutes of the main shock, the fault produced two more. Part 3. Two more. At 9:07. At roughly 7 minutes past 9 in the morning, two more earthquakes struck the same area. One registered magnitude 3.0, the other registered magnitude 2.8. In the language of seismology, these are aftershocks, and before we go any further it is worth being precise about what that word means, because it is used loosely in ordinary conversation in a way that obscures something important. An aftershock is not a separate phenomenon from an earthquake. It is an earthquake. The only thing that makes it an aftershock is that it occurred in the same region, shortly after a larger event, and is understood to be a consequence of the stress redistribution that the larger event caused. When a patch of fault slips, it does not simply release stress. It moves stress around. Some of the surrounding rock is unloaded, some of it is loaded further, pushed closer to failure than it was before. The aftershock sequence is that redistributed stress finding the weakest available places to fail. There is a rule of thumb in the field called Barth's law, and it says that the largest aftershock in a sequence tends to run about 1.2 magnitude units below the main shock. It is an empirical observation rather than a physical law, and the scatter around it is substantial, but it gives you a baseline expectation. For a magnitude 3.8 main shock, Barth's law would predict a largest aftershock somewhere around magnitude 2.6. The largest aftershock on Thursday morning was a magnitude 3.0. That is above the expectation. Not dramatically, not alarmingly, and well inside the ordinary scatter you see in real sequences, which is why no seismologist reacted to it publicly, but it is worth noting for what it is. A sequence slightly more productive than the minimum you would expect. The fault did not slip once and go quiet. It slipped, and then it slipped twice more within 37 minutes. Here is the question that actually matters about those aftershocks, and it is not their size. It is where they were. Both of them occurred in the same area as the main shock, same patch, essentially. And an aftershock sequence that stays in one place, decaying in magnitude and frequency over hours and days, is the textbook picture of a small rupture finishing its business. It is the ordinary, boring, overwhelmingly common outcome, and it is what the Hayward Fault produces on a regular basis. The pattern that would be different, the pattern that would make a seismologist put down their coffee, is migration. If earthquakes begin stepping progressively along the fault, north toward Berkeley or south toward Hayward, appearing in sequence at increasing distances from the original epicenter over hours or days, that is a fundamentally different signal. Migration suggests that stress is being transferred along strike, that failure is propagating rather than settling. It suggests a system doing something rather than a system finishing something. That did not happen on Thursday. The watch criterion going forward is migration, not magnitude, and I want you to hold on to that distinction, because it is the single most useful thing a non-specialist can know about how to read an earthquake sequence. Almost everyone watches the numbers. The people who actually study this watch the map. Consider what those two aftershocks actually demonstrate about the state of the rock down there, because it is easy to hear the word aftershock and file it under aftermath, as though it were debris settling. That is not what it is. A patch of crust roughly 5 kilometers beneath the Oakland hills was close enough to failure on Thursday morning that a magnitude 3.8 was sufficient to push it over the edge. Not once. Twice, within 37 minutes. That tells you the rock in that volume is not sitting comfortably. It is sitting near its threshold, which is what a loaded fault looks like from the inside. Stress on the Hayward Fault accumulates because the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate are grinding past each other at a rate that does not pause, does not slow, and does not care what happened on Thursday. That relative motion is the engine, and it has been running without interruption for millions of years. The fault is not storing stress because something unusual is happening. It is storing stress because the plates are moving, which is the default condition of this planet. There is also a timing detail in the sequence that is worth pulling out. 37 minutes is fast. Aftershock sequences follow a decay pattern described by Omori's law, which says the rate of aftershocks falls off roughly in inverse proportion to the time elapsed since the main shock. In plain terms, aftershocks are most frequent immediately afterward, and the rate drops steeply. Most of what a small sequence is going to produce, it produces in the first hours. Getting 2 events, including one above the Bath's law expectation, inside the first 40 minutes is a sequence front-loading itself in exactly the way the mathematics predicts. And that mathematics is the reason officials repeated the standard guidance about drop, cover and hold on, while noting that the area remains seismically active. That guidance sounds like boilerplate, and in a sense it is. But it exists because the single most reliable statement anyone can make in the hours after an earthquake is that the probability of another one in the same place has gone up, not down. Not to a high number, just to a higher number than it was the day before. Aftershock probability is one of the very few genuinely forecastable quantities in this entire field, and it is forecastable precisely because Omori's law is so consistent across so many different faults in so many different countries. Which leaves the question that the aftershocks cannot answer. They tell us the immediate volume of rock was near failure. They tell us nothing whatsoever about the much larger volume, the locked section running for tens of kilometers beneath the East Bay, that would have to fail all at once to produce something like 1868. A magnitude 3.8 and its 2 small companions are a conversation happening in one room of a very large building. The rest of the building did not participate. There is a standard figure that emergency managers and the Geological Survey use in the hours after any earthquake, and it is the closest thing to a forecast anyone can responsibly offer. Roughly 1 in 20 earthquakes is followed within a week by something larger. That is the base rate, about 5%, and it applies to essentially any earthquake anywhere, including this one. It is not a Hayward-specific number, and it is not elevated by anything unusual about Thursday morning. It simply reflects the empirical observation that most earthquakes are the largest event in their own sequence, and a minority are not. 5% is small enough to be reassuring and large enough that agencies are obliged to mention it, which is exactly why post-earthquake public messaging always sounds slightly hedged. It is not evasion. It is a genuinely awkward number to communicate. The other thing that figure obscures is the difference between 2 kinds of sequence, and it is a distinction we spent a fair amount of time on yesterday, in the video about the swarm on the central San Andreas. A main shock aftershock sequence has a clear largest event at the beginning, followed by a decaying tail, which is what Thursday morning produced. A swarm has no dominant event at all, a cluster of similar-sized earthquakes over days, sometimes escalating rather than decaying, often associated with fluid movement through the fault zone. Thursday was unambiguously the first kind, one event, two smaller ones behind it, decaying on schedule. That is the ordinary pattern, and recognizing which pattern you're looking at is most of the interpretive work. And there is a reason the map matters more here than almost anywhere else on Earth, which brings us to the strangest institutional reaction of the morning. Because a magnitude 3.8, an earthquake small enough that a substantial number of people slept through it, slowed down every train in the San Francisco Bay Area. Part 4. Why every train? In the Bay Area slowed down. Within minutes of the shaking, Bay Area Rapid Transit put its trains on reduced speed orders across the entire system. Crews went out to inspect track. Riders were told to expect residual delays of up to 20 minutes system-wide, for a magnitude 3.8. I want to sit on that for a moment, because on its face it looks like an overreaction, and it is not one. It is the most revealing institutional response of the entire morning, and it tells you more about the Hayward Fault than any number the Geological Survey published. Transit agencies in seismic regions run automated protocols tied to ground motion thresholds. When instruments register shaking above a certain level, trains slow or stop automatically, and they do not resume normal operations until track has been physically walked and cleared. The logic is unglamorous and completely sound. Rail is unforgiving of small geometric changes. A track that has shifted laterally by a few centimetres, a ballast bed that has slumped, a fastener that has worked loose, a retaining wall that has cracked. None of these are visible from the cab of a train moving at 70 miles an hour, and all of them are catastrophic at that speed. The cost of slowing every train in the network for an hour is measured in inconvenience. The cost of not slowing them is measured in a different unit entirely. But the reason this particular response is worth dwelling on is the geometry underneath it. Bay Area Rapid Transit does not merely operate near the Hayward Fault, it crosses it. The Berkeley Hills Tunnel, a twin-bore structure running approximately 3.2 miles through the hills east of Berkeley, passes directly through the fault zone. Trains carrying passengers travel through a tunnel that intersects the trace of a fault which is currently 157 years and 10 months into a 161-year average cycle. That is not a hypothetical exposure identified by an outside consultant. It is a known, mapped, studied crossing, and it has been the subject of engineering assessment for decades precisely because everyone involved understands what it is. So when a magnitude 3.8 occurs on that fault, the protocol that slows the trains is not responding to the shaking. The shaking was minor. It is responding to the possibility, however small, that something moved in a place where movement is not survivable at speed. The response was not proportional to the earthquake, it was proportional to the fault, and that distinction is the whole video in miniature. Everything about the Bay Area's relationship with the Hayward Fault runs on that same logic, whether or not the people living there think about it consciously. Building codes in the East Bay are what they are because of this fault. The Alquist-Priolo zoning that restricts construction directly astride active fault traces exists because of faults like this one. Water infrastructure has been re-engineered at enormous cost because of where this fault runs. The institutions know, the engineering knows, the maps know. What is strange is how completely that knowledge can coexist with an ordinary Thursday. Because here is what actually happened after the train slowed down. The track was inspected, nothing was found, normal service resumed, the delays cleared, and by the afternoon, the several million people who had felt a sharp jolt at 8:30 in the morning had returned to a life conducted entirely on top of a fault that had not changed in any respect since the moment before the earthquake, and would not change in any respect for the rest of the day. The hazard was constant. The response was a spike. That is the pattern, and it repeats at every scale, from a single commuter to an entire region. There is one more thing about the transit response worth flagging, and it points forward to something we will get into in detail later. The reason the Berkeley Hills Tunnel is a known vulnerability is not that the shaking there would be especially severe. It is that a rupture on the Hayward Fault would not just shake the tunnel, it would offset it. Strike-slip faults move the ground on one side horizontally past the other, and a structure that spans the fault gets sheared. You cannot design a tunnel to resist that. You can only design one to fail in a controlled and repairable way, or you can build a second tunnel that avoids the problem, and both of those approaches have been used within a few hundred feet of each other in the Berkeley Hills. The Bay Area has a recent painful lesson in why transit agencies behave this way, and it did not even involve the Hayward Fault. On the 17th of October, 1989, A magnitude 6.9 earthquake struck on the San Andreas Fault system near Loma Prieta in the Santa Cruz Mountains. That epicenter is roughly 60 miles from Oakland. 60 miles is a long way in seismic terms, and the shaking in the East Bay was substantially attenuated by the time it arrived. It still brought down the Cypress Street Viaduct, a double-deck section of freeway in Oakland, killing dozens of people when the upper deck collapsed onto the lower one. It still dropped a section of the upper deck of the Bay Bridge. More than 60 people died in total, and the great majority of the deaths occurred not near the epicenter but in structures around the bay, tens of miles away, sitting on soft ground. That is the crucial detail. The Cypress structure was built on soft, water-saturated bay mud, and soft sediment amplifies seismic shaking dramatically. Waves that arrive from bedrock slow down as they enter weaker material, and to conserve energy their amplitude increases. A site on mud can shake several times harder than a site on rock a short distance away, and it shakes for longer and at frequencies that happen to be dangerous for mid-rise structures. So the East Bay learned, in 1989, that an earthquake 60 miles away on a different fault could kill people in Oakland. Every protocol that slowed a train on Thursday morning traces back to that lesson in some form. And the obvious follow-up question is the one nobody in the region enjoys asking out loud. If a 6.9 60 miles away did that, what does a 6.8 directly underneath do? The answer to that question exists in enormous detail, and we will get to it. But the response to Thursday morning is a downstream consequence of it. The agencies are not guessing about their exposure. They have read the report. But before we get to the engineering, we need to understand what kind of structure we are actually talking about, because the Hayward Fault is not simply a crack in the ground. It is a very specific kind of machine, and its behavior is stranger than almost anyone outside of seismology realizes. Part 5. The Fault Under the City. The Pacific Plate and the North American Plate are moving past each other, not toward each other in most of California, and not apart, past. The Pacific side is traveling northwest relative to the North American side at a rate of roughly 5 centimeters a year, which is about the speed your fingernails grow, and that motion has been going on for millions of years and will continue for millions more. That relative motion has to be accommodated somewhere. In the popular imagination, it is all accommodated by the San Andreas Fault, which is the famous one, the one that gets the movies. In reality, the San Andreas takes a bit more than half of it, and the rest is distributed across a family of parallel faults that run alongside it, splitting the load. The Hayward Fault is one of those. So is the Calaveras Fault to its east, and the Rogers Creek Fault to its north, and the Macama and Bartlett Springs faults further north still, which we have spent time on before in this channel's coverage of the Northern Coast Ranges. The Hayward is a right lateral strike-slip fault, and that phrase is worth unpacking because the physical picture it describes is genuinely useful. Stand on one side of the fault and look across it. In a right lateral fault, the ground on the far side moves to your right. It does not matter which side you stand on. The geometry is symmetric, which is one of those small facts that makes the concept click once you see it. The motion is horizontal. The two blocks of crust are sliding past one another, not riding over one another. Now, the surface of a fault is not smooth. It is rough rock pressed against rough rock under the weight of several kilometers of overlying crust, and the friction is enormous. The plates keep moving. The fault in its deeper sections does not. So the rock on either side deforms elastically, storing the strain the way a bent steel bar stores energy, and it goes on storing it for decades or centuries until the accumulated force exceeds the friction holding the fault shut. Then a patch lets go. The stored strain releases as slip and as seismic waves, and everything that had been bent gradually over 160 years straightens out in about 10 seconds. That is an earthquake. Not the ground breaking, but the ground unbending. The Hayward Fault runs along the eastern edge of San Francisco Bay, following the base of the East Bay Hills. From roughly Richmond in the north, it threads south through Berkeley, Oakland, San Leandro, Hayward, Union City, and down to Fremont. Those are not towns near the fault. In many places, the fault trace runs directly beneath the developed corridor, through neighborhoods, under streets, past schools, beneath university property, along the line where the flatlands meet the hills. The geography is not coincidental, incidentally. The hills exist because the fault is there. Tens of kilometers of accumulated motion along a slightly restraining bend has pushed that topography up over geological time. The scenery is the fault's signature. The population living on and immediately adjacent to that trace is on the order of 2 million people. The The wider Bay Area is around 7.7 million. To the north, the Hayward Fault continues under San Pablo Bay, and for a long time that was where the map got uncertain. The Rogers Creek Fault picks up on the other side of the bay and continues north through Santa Rosa, and the question of whether these were two separate faults or one continuous structure mattered enormously, because rupture length controls earthquake magnitude. A fault that ends is a fault with a ceiling. A fault that connects to another fault has a much higher ceiling. In October of 2016, a team led by Janet Watt at the Geological Survey published the answer in the journal Science Advances. Using high-resolution subsurface imaging and sediment cores taken from the floor of San Pablo Bay, they showed the Hayward Fault crossing beneath the bay and bending about 10 degrees to the right, connecting directly to the Rogers Creek Fault at the surface, not near it, connected to it. The combined system runs approximately 118 miles. If it were to rupture along its full length in a single event, it could produce a magnitude 7.4. Hold that number, because it changes the shape of the ceiling. A magnitude 6.8, which is what 1868 produced, is the benchmark event for the Hayward Fault on its own. A magnitude 7.4 releases roughly 8 times as much energy as a 6.8. The difference between those two scenarios is not a matter of degree. It is a different disaster with a different geographic footprint and a different recovery timeline. Now, that combined rupture is the upper bound rather than the expectation, and it is worth saying clearly that the more likely single event is a Hayward-only rupture in the range of magnitude 6.5 to 7.1, which is the characteristic range the Paleoseismic record supports. But the ceiling is real, it is published, and it is one of the reasons this fault occupies the position it does in American seismic hazard assessment. The physical model underlying all of this has a name and a specific origin, and it is worth knowing because it came out of a Bay Area earthquake. After the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, a geologist named Harry Fielding Reid studied survey measurements taken across the San Andreas Fault before and after the rupture. What he found was that the ground on either side of the fault had been progressively deforming for decades before the earthquake, bending like a strained material, and that the earthquake had released that deformation and returned the rock to a relaxed state. He called it elastic rebound, and it remains the foundational description of how earthquakes on strike-slip faults work. Elastic rebound is why elapsed time matters at all. If earthquakes were purely random events with no memory, the 157 years since 1868 would carry no information whatsoever. But if strain accumulates progressively, then time is a proxy for stored energy, and a fault that has been loading for a century and a half holds more than one that ruptured a decade ago. There is a second structural feature of the Bay Area worth understanding, because it explains why the region has so many faults, rather than one big one. The plate motion has to be accommodated in total, but there is no rule that says a single structure must do all the accommodating. Where a plate boundary is not a clean line, the motion gets partitioned across a family of sub-parallel faults spread over a wide zone. In the Bay Area, that zone is roughly 100 kilometers across, and the San Andreas, the Hayward, the Calaveras, the Rogers Creek, the Green Valley, and several others each take a share. Partitioning has an important consequence for hazard. It means no single fault carries the full slip rate, so each individual fault has a longer recurrence interval than a single through-going structure would. But it also means there are many faults, each capable of a damaging earthquake, distributed throughout the region rather than confined to one line you could simply avoid building on. The Bay Area does not have a fault. It has a fault system, and the Hayward is the branch of it that runs through the most people. Which brings us to the only direct observation anyone has ever made of what this fault does when it actually lets go. There is exactly one such observation in the historical record, and it happened on an October morning in a California that most people alive today would not recognize. Part 6. October 21st, 1868. On the morning of the 21st of October, 1868, the Hayward Fault ruptured. The San Francisco Bay Area of that year held approximately 260,000 people. San Francisco itself was a boom city, 20 years past the gold rush, built fast and built badly in large sections, with a great deal of unreinforced masonry and a considerable amount of construction sitting on filled ground along the waterfront. The East Bay was farmland and small towns. The town of Hayward had about 500 residents. The earthquake registered an estimated magnitude of 6.8, with estimates in the literature ranging up to about 7.0. 30 people were killed. In Hayward itself, nearly every building in the town was either destroyed outright or damaged so extensively that it had to be pulled down. That is not a figure of speech or a dramatic summary. That is the assessment. A town of 500 people, and essentially the entire built environment rendered unusable in less than a minute. The adobe church at Mission San Jose collapsed. Adobe is a material with almost no tensile strength, and it performs about as badly under seismic loading as any traditional building material can perform, which is why so few adobe structures from that era survive in California's fault corridors. In San Francisco, across the bay, buildings cracked and fell, and the filled ground along the waterfront behaved the way filled ground always behaves in an earthquake, which is to say much worse than the bedrock a few blocks away. The damage was severe enough, and the event significant enough, that for the next 38 years, until April of 1906, this was simply known as the Great San Francisco Earthquake. It was the benchmark. It was the one people meant. Then, 1906 happened. A magnitude 7.9 on the San Andreas Fault with a rupture length of nearly 500 kilometers and a fire that burned for days. And 1868 was demoted in the collective memory to a footnote. It has stayed a footnote ever since. Ask 100 people in the Bay Area to name a historic earthquake, and 99 of them will say 1906. The Geological Survey, for its part, still lists 1868 among the most destructive earthquakes in California history, and it is right to. Here is why that demotion matters, and it is not a matter of historical fairness. 1906 was a San Andreas event. The San Andreas in the Bay Area runs offshore and along the peninsula, west of most of the population. 1868 was a Hayward event, and the Hayward runs directly underneath the population. Those two facts produce very different disasters, even at similar magnitudes, because seismic energy attenuates with distance. Every kilometre between a rupture and a building is a kilometre of rock-absorbing energy. A magnitude 6.8 directly beneath a city can do more damage than a magnitude 7.5 100 kilometres away. So the historical record has left the Bay Area with a slightly misleading intuition. The famous earthquake is the far one, the under-remembered earthquake is the near one, and it is the near one that is due. Now, 30 deaths sounds almost survivable by the standards of modern disaster reporting, and this is where the comparison has to be made carefully in both directions, because there are two large changes since 1868, and they pull in opposite directions. The first change is exposure, and it is enormous. 260,000 people then, roughly 7.7 million now. That is close to a 30-fold increase, concentrated in exactly the corridor the fault runs through, with high-rise construction, freeway overpasses, buried gas transmission lines, water tunnels, rail tunnels, hospitals, and a regional economy that is deeply dependent on infrastructure functioning continuously. The second change is engineering, and it is also enormous, and it works the other way. Modern California building codes are among the most stringent seismic codes in the world, developed iteratively after every damaging earthquake in the state's history. Buildings constructed to current standards are designed with the explicit expectation of strong shaking. Bridges have been retrofitted, hospitals have been rebuilt to remain operational after a major event. The Bay Area of 2026 is dramatically more resilient, building for building, than the Bay Area of 1868 or even of 1989. The honest answer about what a repeat would do is therefore not a simple multiplication. It is a genuinely difficult modelling problem, and it is one that has been worked in extraordinary detail, which we will get to because the answer is on the record and the number is not 30. It is worth trying to imagine what that morning actually involved, because the numbers flatten it. A magnitude 6.8 in the shallow crust produces strong shaking for something on the order of 10 to 20 seconds. That is a long time. Count it out, and it becomes uncomfortable to sit through even in an ordinary room. In 1868, that shaking arrived at buildings made of unreinforced brick, of adobe, of unbraced timber frames sitting on unbolted foundations, with heavy tile or masonry parapets at roof level and no lateral load path of any kind. None of these materials fail gracefully. Unreinforced masonry in particular is essentially a stack of individual units held together by mortar, with almost no tensile capacity, and when the ground moves horizontally underneath it, walls separate from floors and the whole assembly comes apart. The pattern of damage in San Francisco that day also contained the region's first clear lesson about ground conditions, though nobody had the vocabulary for it yet. The worst damage in the city concentrated on made ground, areas along the waterfront where the shoreline had been extended outward, using fill dumped into the bay. Buildings on that fill fared dramatically worse than identical buildings a few blocks inland on firmer material. The same amplification physics that would kill people on the Cypress structure 121 years later was already visible in 1868, written in the distribution of collapsed walls, and that is the deepest reason this earthquake matters more than its position in a history book. It is the only direct observation anyone has ever made of the Hayward Fault producing a major earthquake. Everything else we know about this fault's large event behaviour is inference, from trenches, from models, from analogy with other faults. 1868 is the single data point where the fault did the thing, and people were standing on top of it writing down what happened. One data point is not a lot to reason from, it is what there is. But before that, there is one more detail about 1868 that has been sitting under this entire discussion, and it is the reason we started this video where we started it. Because that earthquake did not just shake the ground, it broke it visibly at the surface for 20 miles, and geologists know exactly where that break began and where it ended. Part 7. The 20 miles that started at San Leandro. When a fault ruptures deep in the crust, the slip does not always reach the surface. In smaller earthquakes it never does. The rock deforms at depth, the seismic waves radiate outward, and the ground at the top shakes without ever tearing. You can stand on the epicenter of a magnitude 5 and find nothing at all when you look down. Above a certain size, that changes. The rupture propagates upward as well as sideways, and eventually it breaks through into the open air, and when it does it leaves a physical line across the landscape. Fences offset, roads bent, curbs stepped sideways, rows of crops that used to be straight, suddenly not straight. This is surface rupture, and for the geologists who study earthquakes it is the single most valuable piece of evidence an earthquake can leave behind, because it converts an invisible subsurface event into a mapped, measurable, permanent record. The 1868 earthquake produced surface rupture, and it was mapped. The break was traced for approximately 20 miles, about 32 kilometers. Its southern end was in what is now the Warm Springs district of Fremont. Its northern end was at San Leandro. Thursday morning's earthquake occurred approximately 2.5 miles from San Leandro. I want to handle this carefully, because this is exactly the point in a video like this where the temptation is to let a coincidence do the work of an argument. So let me state plainly what this does and does not mean. It does not mean the fault is preparing to rupture at the same place. Earthquakes do not queue politely at the ends of old ruptures waiting for their turn. It does not mean that Thursday's event was a foreshock, and there is no statistical framework in seismology that would let anyone say so in advance. Retrospective studies consistently find that only a small percentage of moderate earthquakes turn out to have been foreshocks to something larger, and, this is the part that gets left out, you cannot tell which ones until afterward. Foreshocks are a category that only exist in hindsight. Every foreshock in history was, at the time it happened, an ordinary earthquake that people looked at and shrugged about. What the coincidence does mean is more modest and, I would argue, more interesting. It means that Thursday's earthquake occurred in a place where we have direct physical evidence that this fault has broken the surface before. Not inferred, not modelled. Observed and recorded by people who walked the ground in 1868 and wrote down what they saw. That is a rarer thing than it sounds. For most faults on Earth, we have no historical surface rupture at all. We have paleoseismology, trenches dug across the fault, layers of sediment offset by past events, radiocarbon dates bracketing when each one occurred. That work is painstaking, and it is how the recurrence intervals get built, but it is inference from disturbed dirt. The Hayward Fault has that, and it also has a 19th century eyewitness map of an actual break. There is a second reason the endpoints of the 1868 rupture matter, and this one is genuinely load-bearing for the hazard assessment rather than merely evocative. Rupture length controls magnitude. This is one of the most robust relationships in all of earthquake science. A longer break releases more energy, produces a larger magnitude, and shakes a wider area for a longer duration. 20 miles of surface rupture is consistent with a magnitude in the high sixes, which is precisely what 1868 is estimated at. The geometry and the magnitude agree, But the Hayward Fault is considerably longer than 20 miles. The fault itself, from Richmond down to Fremont, runs roughly 45 to 50 miles. Add the Rogers Creek Fault to the north, connected beneath San Pablo Bay as the 2016 imaging showed, and the system is about 118 miles, which means 1868 did not break the whole thing. It broke a section. That is the uncomfortable arithmetic hiding inside the historical record. The benchmark event, the one that flattened Hayward and killed 30 people, and held the title of Great San Francisco Earthquake for 38 years, was a partial rupture of a much longer structure. There is more fault available than 1868 used. Now, whether a future rupture goes longer is not something anyone can predict, and there are physical reasons why ruptures often stop where they stop. Faults have geometric complexities, bends, stepovers, changes in orientation, sections with different frictional properties, and these can act as barriers that arrest a propagating rupture. The 10-degree right bend beneath San Pablo Bay is exactly the kind of feature that might stop a rupture from continuing north into the Rogers Creek Fault. Or it might not. The 2016 study's central finding was that the connection is direct enough at the surface that a through-going rupture cannot be ruled out, and that is a meaningfully different statement from the previous understanding, in which a gap between the faults made a combined rupture look unlikely. This is the same question we've run into repeatedly on this channel with other California structures, with the Northern Coast Range's faults, with the creeping section of the San Andreas, with every case where the crucial issue is not whether a fault will break, but how far the break will run once it starts. The honest position is that rupture extent is one of the least predictable quantities in the field, and that hazard models therefore have to carry a range of scenarios rather than a single expected outcome. What we can say with confidence is narrower and still worth knowing. The Hayward Fault has produced within written history a rupture that broke 20 miles of ground and ended near San Leandro. On Thursday near San Leandro, that fault moved again, trivially in energy terms, but in the same place, in the same system, driven by the same plate motion that has been loading it continuously since 1868. And the loading is the thing, because the plates have not stopped for a single day in 157 years, and everything that motion has put into the fault is still in there. There is a rule of thumb in rupture mechanics worth knowing here, because it is the closest thing the field has to a prediction about how far a break will run. Ruptures tend to stop at geometric discontinuities, where a fault steps sideways to a parallel strand rather than continuing in a straight line, that stepover acts as an obstacle. The propagating rupture reaches the end of one strand and has to jump the gap to keep going, and whether it does depends on how wide the gap is and how the stress field is oriented. The empirical observation, gathered from many earthquakes worldwide, is that ruptures rarely jump stepovers wider than about 5 kilometers, and frequently stop at ones considerably narrower. This is the framework that made the 2016 San Pablo Bay imaging so consequential. Before that work, the relationship between the Hayward and Rogers Creek faults beneath the bay was poorly resolved, and the working assumption in hazard models was that whatever separated them might arrest a rupture. The imaging showed a 10-degree bend and a direct connection rather than a wide stepover, which does not guarantee a through-going rupture, but removes the most convenient reason for assuming one is impossible. Bends and stepovers are also why the 1868 rupture may have stopped where it stopped. Something arrested it near San Leandro at the northern end, and near Warm Springs at the southern end, and the honest answer is that we do not know precisely what. Whatever it was, there is no guarantee it will arrest the next one, because barriers that hold under one stress configuration can fail under another. So how much is still in there? That question has an answer, and the answer comes from a trench. Part 8. 161 years, plus or minus 65. To find out how often a fault produces large earthquakes, you dig a hole across it. The technique is called paleoseismology, and the principle is beautifully simple even though the execution is anything but. You select a site where sediment has been accumulating steadily across the fault trace, a marshy area, an old stream channel, somewhere layers pile up year after year without being scoured away. You excavate a trench perpendicular to the fault, deep enough to expose those layers in cross-section, and you shore the walls so you can work inside it. Then you look at the stratigraphy. In undisturbed ground, the layers are continuous. Where an earthquake has ruptured the surface, they are not. A layer that was flat and unbroken gets torn, offset, folded, or truncated. Sand can be injected upward through cracks. Material can slump into a fissure, and fill it with sediment that does not match the surrounding layers. Each of these disruptions is the signature of one event, and crucially, layers deposited after the event bury the disruption and are themselves undisturbed until the next earthquake. So the trench wall becomes a stacked record. Event, quiet period, event, quiet period, going back as far as the sediment does. Organic material in the layers can be radiocarbon dated, which brackets each event in time. Do this at multiple sites along a fault, correlate the events, and you can build a chronology of past ruptures with real dates attached. This work has been done on the Hayward Fault, and the results have shaped how the entire Bay Area understands its risk. A team led by James Leemkemper at the Geological Survey published a recurrence estimate derived from that paleoseismic record. Large events comparable to 1868 occur on the Hayward Fault, with a mean recurrence interval of 161 years, plus or minus 65 years at one standard deviation. The individual intervals in the record are the more visceral version of that statistic. The gaps between successive earthquakes range from about 95 years to about 183 years, averaging roughly 150 years. The elapsed time since 1868 is 157 years and 10 months. Let me put that in context in a way the raw numbers do not quite convey. If this fault's next interval turns out to be a short one, at the 95-year end of the observed range, then the Bay Area passed its due date more than 60 years ago and has been living on borrowed time since the early 1960s. If the interval runs long, at 183 years, there are about 25 years left, and the mean sits at 161, which is to say roughly 3 years from now. None of those are predictions, all of them are inside the data. This is the part where I have to be honest with you about what a recurrence interval actually is, because it is one of the most systematically misunderstood concepts in this entire subject, and the misunderstanding cuts both ways. A mean recurrence interval is not a schedule. Faults do not accumulate a debt that comes due on a date. The physical process is stochastic. The timing depends on the local stress state, on the strength of the specific patch that has to fail first, on stress transferred from neighbouring faults, on fluid pressures in the fault zone, on factors that are not measurable from the surface, and in some cases are not measurable at all. Two intervals on the same fault differed by 88 years in the observed record. That is the spread you are dealing with. So the fault is not late in the sense that a train is late. There is no timetable being violated. But, and this is where the other half of the misunderstanding lives, the absence of a schedule does not mean the elapsed time is uninformative. It absolutely is informative. Strain accumulates as a function of time because plate motion is steady. 157 years of loading has put more strain into this fault than 80 years of loading would have. The probability of failure in the next decade is genuinely higher now than it was in 1900, and it will be higher still in 2050 if nothing has happened by then. The clock does not tell you when. It tells you that the odds are not what they were. There is one more subtlety in the Leemkemper figure that deserves attention, and it is going to become the centre of this entire video shortly. Notice how short that recurrence interval is. 161 years is fast for a fault that produces magnitude 6.5 to 7.1 earthquakes. The San Andreas in Northern California, which produced the 1906 event, has a recurrence interval on the order of 200 to 300 years. The Cascadia subduction zone, which we have covered extensively on this channel, has a mean interval in the range of several centuries, and it is 326 years into it. The Hayward Fault runs on a shorter cycle than either of them, at a smaller magnitude, in a more heavily populated place. Why? That question has an answer. It was published in the Bulletin of the Seismological Society of America. It is well supported, and it is the single most counterintuitive fact about the Hayward Fault, the one that inverts almost everything the general public believes about how faults behave. The dating side of this work deserves a moment, because it is what converts a stack of disturbed layers into a chronology with numbers attached. Organic material in sediment, a fragment of wood, a seed, charcoal, peat, contains carbon absorbed from the atmosphere while the organism was alive. One isotope of that carbon, carbon-14, is radioactive and decays at a known rate after the organism dies. Measure how much remains and you can calculate how long ago that happened. Applied to a layer immediately beneath a rupture horizon and a layer immediately above it, radiocarbon brackets the earthquake between two dates, and with enough samples across enough sites, the brackets tighten into a usable chronology. Doing this on the Hayward Fault carries a difficulty that a fault in open country does not. The fault runs beneath a continuously developed urban corridor. You cannot dig a 20-metre trench through a residential street, and much of the ground along the trace has been graded, filled, paved and built over for a century, destroying or burying the very layers the technique depends on. The paleoseismic record for this fault has been assembled from a limited number of usable sites, and that constraint is part of why the uncertainty on the recurrence interval is plus or minus 65 years rather than something tighter. It is worth setting this alongside another fault we have spent a great deal of time on. The Cascadia subduction zone off the Pacific Northwest last ruptured in 1700, 326 years ago, against a mean interval measured in centuries. That fault gets described as overdue too, and it produces a magnitude 9 rather than a magnitude 7. But Cascadia is largely offshore, and the great majority of the population sits tens to hundreds of kilometres from the rupture surface. The Hayward Fault is 157 years into a shorter cycle, producing a smaller earthquake, with the population directly on top of the rupture rather than at a distance from it. Different fault, different physics, and a comparable amount of unease for entirely different reasons. Before we get there, though, we need to deal with the word that has been doing an enormous amount of unexamined work in this video and in every piece of coverage about this fault for the past 40 years: overdue. Part 9. What overdue actually means. Overdue is a word from accounting. It implies a due date, an obligation, a party who has failed to pay. Applied to a fault, it smuggles in a set of assumptions that the physics does not support, and it is worth taking a few minutes to replace it with something more precise, because the precise version is not less alarming. It is more. Seismologists prefer probabilities. Specifically, they express hazard as the likelihood of an earthquake above a certain magnitude occurring on a given fault or in a given region within a given time window. The standard window in California is 30 years, chosen because it approximates the term of a mortgage, which is a genuinely practical framing. It is the period over which a person deciding where to live and how to build has a stake. Here are the numbers. For the San Francisco Bay Area as a whole, the Geological Survey puts the probability of a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake within 30 years at approximately 72%. That figure covers all the faults in the region collectively: the San Andreas, the Hayward, the Calaveras, the Rogers Creek, the Concord Green Valley, and the rest of the family. Roughly 7 chances in 10, within 30 years, somewhere in the Bay Area. Break that down by individual fault, and the Hayward-Rogers Creek system carries the highest single fault probability of any structure in the region, cited in the range of 27 to 31% for a magnitude 6.7 or greater rupture in 30 years. So call it roughly 3 chances in 10 on this specific fault in the next 3 decades. Now, 3 in 10 does not sound like a certainty, and it is not 1. There is a 70% chance it does not happen in that window. People hear 27% and file it mentally under probably not, which is technically correct and completely misleading, because the relevant comparison is not to certainty. It is to every other risk you actively manage. Think about what odds you accept elsewhere. Nobody considers a 1 in 10 chance of a house fire over 30 years acceptable without insurance. Nobody drives without a seatbelt on the grounds that most trips end fine. We buy protection against risks with far lower probabilities and far smaller consequences than this, routinely, without thinking of ourselves as anxious people. A 30% chance of a magnitude 7 directly beneath 2 million people is, in any ordinary framework of risk management, an enormous number. There is a second thing worth understanding about how these probabilities are built, because it explains why the Hayward number is as high as it is. Modern California hazard forecasts are constructed from multiple lines of evidence combined into a single model. Fault slip rates measured by satellite geodesy, paleoseismic recurrence intervals from trenches, the historical earthquake catalogue, and the physics of how stress transfers between connected faults. Some of the models are time-independent, treating earthquakes as random in time. Others are time-dependent, incorporating elapsed time since the last event on the assumption that strain rebuilds progressively. Time-dependent models are the ones where 157 years of elapsed time pushes the probability upward. The Hayward Fault scores high in both approaches. It has a high slip rate, a well-constrained short recurrence interval, a documented recent rupture, and a long elapsed time. Every input points the same direction. And now, let me deal with the energy question I promised earlier, because it puts Thursday morning firmly in its place. The magnitude scale is logarithmic. Each whole unit represents roughly 32 times more energy released. Thursday's earthquake was a magnitude 3.8. The 1868 earthquake was a magnitude 6.8. That is a difference of 3 whole units, which corresponds to a factor of approximately 35,000 in energy. And if you scale it against the combined system magnitude 7.4 scenario, the ratio climbs to something on the order of 250,000. Put concretely, it would take on the order of tens of thousands of Thursday morning earthquakes to release the energy stored for a single 1868. Not spread over years. That is the entire budget. This is why the idea that small earthquakes relieve pressure and protect us from large ones is not merely wrong, but almost comically wrong. The energy accounting does not work. It is not close to working. A fault could produce a magnitude 3.8 every single day for a century and barely register against the strain accumulating from plate motion over the same period. There are 2 families of model used to produce these figures, and the difference between them is worth understanding because it is where most of the argument in the field actually happens. The first family treats earthquakes as memoryless. In this approach, the probability that a fault ruptures in the next year is the same regardless of when it last ruptured. A fault that broke 10 years ago and a fault that broke 300 years ago carry identical annual odds. That sounds obviously wrong when stated baldly, but it has a real justification. The physical variables that determine when a specific patch fails are so poorly known that treating the timing as random may be more honest than pretending to model it. The second family is time-dependent. These models assume strain rebuilds progressively after an earthquake, so the probability of failure starts low immediately afterward and climbs as elapsed time approaches and then exceeds the mean recurrence interval. Time-dependent models are where the phrase overdue acquires any technical meaning at all, and they are the reason the Hayward Fault's numbers sit where they do. A fault 157 years into a 161-year, mean interval is near the peak of its hazard curve under this framework. California's hazard forecasts blend both approaches rather than picking a winner, weighting them according to expert judgment about how much confidence the underlying assumptions deserve. The published probability is therefore not a single model's output. It is a consensus estimate carrying explicit uncertainty, which is why you see ranges like 27 to 31%, rather than a single confident number. There is also a subtlety about the regional figure that trips people up. 72% for the Bay Area does not mean any individual fault is at 72%. It is the aggregate probability that at least one of the region's faults produces a magnitude 6.7 or greater. Individually, each fault carries a much smaller number. Collectively, with enough faults in the family, the odds that none of them does anything for 30 years get small. That is how you arrive at roughly 7 in 10 for the region, while the largest single contributor sits at about 3 in 10. And the practical translation of all this is uncomfortable in a specific way. Nobody in the Bay Area is going to receive a warning. There is no precursor signal that has ever been demonstrated to reliably precede a large earthquake, no instrument that lights up in advance, no threshold anyone is monitoring that would justify an evacuation. The earthquake early warning system that exists provides seconds to tens of seconds of notice after the rupture has already begun. That is genuinely valuable, and it is not prediction. It is fast detection. Small earthquakes do not drain the reservoir, they are drips. Except, and this is where the Hayward Fault stops behaving like the textbook and starts doing something genuinely strange, this particular fault does drain part of its reservoir, continuously, without earthquakes at all. You can go and watch it happen on any given afternoon, with no instruments, standing on a curb in Fremont. And the reason that matters is the exact opposite of what you would expect. Part 10. The fault that moves every single day. There is a curb in Fremont, California that does not run straight. There are, in fact, dozens of features like it scattered along the East Bay corridor, sidewalks with a kink in them, retaining walls with a persistent crack that gets patched and reopens, fences whose posts have drifted out of line, building foundations that have developed a slow diagonal fracture, storm drains that have gone subtly out of alignment. Curbs, in particular, are the classic example, because a curb is a long, straight, rigid line that somebody poured deliberately, and that makes it an accidental measuring instrument. The Hayward Fault is bending them, continuously, right now as you're listening to this. The phenomenon is called aseismic creep, and it is one of the most remarkable behaviors any fault can exhibit. Most faults are locked. The two sides are held together by friction. They do not move relative to one another between earthquakes, and all the motion happens in violent episodes separated by long silences. The Hayward Fault does not do that, at least not in its shallow section. Its shallow section slides, slowly, steadily, aseismically, meaning without producing earthquakes, at a rate you could measure with a ruler if you were patient enough. The rate varies along the length of the fault. Most of it creeps at somewhere between 3 and 6 millimeters per year. There is a segment near the southern end, only 4 to 6 kilometers long, that creeps at about 9 millimeters per year, which is the fastest section on the fault. 6 millimeters a year sounds like nothing. It is about the thickness of a pencil, but it does not stop and it does not skip years, and over the elapsed time since 1868, it adds up to something you can see with your eyes. At 6 millimeters annually, 157 years produces roughly 94 centimeters of accumulated offset, nearly a full meter. That is why the curbs are bent. Somebody poured a straight curb in 1960, and 66 years later there is close to 40 centimeters of drift across the fault trace, and the curb has been quietly deformed into a shape its builder never intended. Geologists have taken advantage of this by installing what are called alignment arrays, sets of survey markers placed in precise straight lines across the fault trace, measured repeatedly over years and decades. The arrays turn the fault into a live instrument. They are the closest thing this fault has to a real-time gauge of its own shallow behavior, and they are one of the reasons the Hayward Fault's creep rate is known with such precision along its whole length. Now, here is the intuition that almost everyone forms when they first learn about creep, and I want to name it clearly because I have held it myself, and because it is entirely reasonable. If the fault is moving all the time, it must be relieving stress. If it is relieving stress, then it is not storing it. A fault that quietly slides past itself year after year is a fault that is letting the pressure out gradually instead of holding it in until it explodes. Creep, on this view, is the safety valve. Creeping faults should be the harmless ones. The dangerous faults are the silent ones, the locked ones, the ones that do nothing for centuries and then do everything at once. It is a clean, physically sensible model. It is the model that a great deal of popular science writing has reinforced. And on the Hayward Fault, the peer-reviewed answer is that it is backwards. We touched on a version of this problem yesterday, in the video about the swarm on the creeping section of the San Andreas Fault, where the evidence from a deep borehole showed that a section everyone had treated as a permanent barrier to rupture had in fact hosted more than 100 large earthquakes over geological time. The lesson there was that creep does not confer immunity, that a fault which slides can also break, and that treating the sliding as protection is a category error. The Hayward Fault takes that lesson further, because on the Hayward the relationship is not merely that creep fails to protect, it is that creep appears to be associated with a fault that breaks more often. To see why, we need to talk about where the creep actually is, because it is not where most people assume. The creep on the Hayward Fault is a shallow phenomenon. It occurs in the upper few kilometers of the crust, in a zone where the rock is relatively weak, where the confining pressure from overlying material is low, and where the fault zone contains minerals with frictional properties that permit steady sliding rather than stick-slip behavior. Serpentinite is often implicated in creeping faults. It is a slippery, weak, hydrated rock, and where it is present in a fault zone it tends to promote continuous slip rather than the locked then released cycle. We have run into this same mineralogy before in the coverage of the Bartlett Springs Fault in the northern Coast Ranges, where the distribution of serpentinite along the fault was used as a proxy to argue about which sections creep and which are locked. Below that shallow zone, conditions change. Pressure increases with depth, temperature increases, the rock is stronger, and the fault surface is held shut far more tightly. Somewhere in the range of a few kilometers down, the Hayward Fault stops creeping and starts behaving like a normal locked fault. And that locked section is where earthquakes come from. The seismogenic zone, the depth range in which earthquakes actually nucleate and propagate, sits well below the creeping layer. Thursday morning's earthquake was at approximately 5.2 kilometers, which places it right around that transition, in the zone where the fault stops sliding freely and starts sticking. Larger events nucleate deeper still and rupture upward. So the picture is not a fault that is uniformly sliding. The picture is a fault whose top few kilometers are lubricated and moving, while everything below is clamped shut and loading. The creeping surface tells you almost nothing about what the locked part is doing, and it certainly does not drain it, because the two are not connected in the way the safety valve intuition assumes. You cannot let the pressure out of a boiler by opening a valve on a different vessel. The alignment arrays are worth describing in a bit more detail because they represent one of the more elegant pieces of low-technology monitoring in the earth sciences. The concept is almost absurdly simple. You set a series of permanent markers into the ground in a straight line running perpendicular across the fault trace, and you survey their positions precisely. Then you come back and survey them again, and again, year after year, decade after decade. If the fault is creeping, the markers on one side migrate relative to the markers on the other, and the line that was straight when you installed it develops a measurable dogleg. Subtract one survey from the next, divide by the elapsed time, and you have a creep rate at that location with millimetre precision. Repeat that at dozens of sites along the length of the fault, and you get something remarkable. A map of how fast every section of the Hayward Fault is sliding, updated continuously, going back decades. That map is why we can say with confidence that most of the fault creeps at 3 to 6 millimetres a year, while a 4 to 6 kilometre segment near the southern end runs at about 9. It is not an estimate from a model, it is measured, one survey at a time. The mineralogy behind the sliding is worth a sentence as well. Serpentinite, which forms when water alters the ultramafic rock of the oceanic mantle, is soft, slippery and weak, and it shows up repeatedly in the fault zones that creep. Where it is present in quantity, the fault surface behaves in a way engineers would call velocity strengthening. The faster it slides, the more it resists, which damps out the runaway acceleration that a real earthquake requires. That is the physical reason a section can slide steadily instead of sticking and snapping. This alone would be enough to dismantle the popular understanding. The fault creeps at the top and locks below, therefore creep does not protect you. But the actual finding in the literature goes considerably further than that, and it is the reason this fault's recurrence interval is as short as it is. Part 11. Why creep makes it worse, not better. The Hayward Fault releases somewhere between 26 and 78% of its total slip budget seismically. That is a wide range, and the width of it is honest. This quantity is genuinely difficult to constrain, and the estimate includes post-seismic slip, the continued creeping that follows an earthquake as the fault zone readjusts. So take the middle of that range, call it roughly half. About half of the motion this fault has to accommodate gets accommodated without earthquakes, by the shallow section quietly sliding. Here is the question that turns everything around. If half the slip is being handled aseismically, and the other half has to come out in earthquakes, what does that do to the size and frequency of those earthquakes? The intuitive answer is that it should reduce them. Less strain reaching the locked zone means fewer or smaller earthquakes. The answer that Kemper and his colleagues published in the Bulletin of the Seismological Society of America is that the Hayward Fault exhibits large earthquakes in the magnitude 6.5 to 7.1 range with short recurrence times of 161 years. Recurrence times that are, in their assessment, probably kept short by the 26 to 78% aseismic release rate. Read that again, because the causal direction is the whole point. The aseismic release is not lengthening the interval between earthquakes, it is shortening it. How can that possibly be true? The mechanism has to do with what creep does to the boundary of the locked patch, and it is worth walking through carefully because it is genuinely elegant. Picture the fault as a plane extending downward. The upper few kilometres are creeping, sliding freely, keeping pace with the plate motion. Below that is the locked zone, stuck accumulating strain. Now consider what happens at the boundary between them. The creeping section above is moving. The locked section below is not. That differential motion has to be absorbed somewhere, and it is absorbed by concentrating stress precisely at the edge of the locked patch. The creeping section, in other words, is not gently relieving the locked section. It is actively loading it, from above, at its margin. Every millimetre the shallow zone slides forward, while the deep zone stays put increases the shear stress on the boundary between them. Creep is not a valve. It is a lever. There is a second consequence, and it concerns the size of the earthquakes rather than their timing. Because a fraction of the fault's area is creeping and therefore unavailable to rupture seismically, the effective area of the locked patch is smaller than the total fault area. Rupture area controls magnitude. A smaller locked patch produces a smaller maximum earthquake. Put those two effects together, and you get the Hayward Fault's characteristic behaviour in a single sentence. a fault that produces moderate earthquakes, 6.5 to 7.1 rather than 7.8 or 8.5, at unusually short intervals, roughly every century and a half, because the creeping upper section keeps the locked patch modest in size and keeps it loaded at its edges. Smaller earthquakes, more often. That is the trade the Hayward Fault makes. Now, if you're sitting somewhere far from a fault, that trade might sound like a good one. A magnitude 6.8 is a great deal less energetic than a magnitude 8, and if the price of avoiding the 8 is having a 6.8 more frequently, a detached observer might take that deal. The Bay Area does not get to be a detached observer, and this is where the trade stops looking attractive. A magnitude 8 on a subduction zone 100 kilometers offshore delivers a fraction of its energy to any given city, attenuated by all that intervening rock. A magnitude 6.8 in the upper crust directly beneath a city delivers a very large fraction of its energy straight into the built environment, with almost no distance to absorb any of it. The relevant quantity for a building is not the magnitude. It is the shaking at that building's foundation, and on that measure, a moderate earthquake underfoot is worse than a great earthquake far away. The Hayward Fault has optimized, if you can call it that, for the worst possible combination from the perspective of the people living above it. Not the largest earthquakes, the most frequent ones that are still large enough to destroy things, generated at shallow depth, directly beneath the densest urban corridor on the eastern shore of the bay. There is one more implication of the creep finding that deserves to be said plainly, because it is the sentence I would want someone to take away from this entire video. The visible movement of the Hayward Fault, the bent curbs, the cracked walls, the offset fences that people in Fremont and Hayward and Berkeley walk past every day without thinking about, is not evidence that the fault is releasing its danger. It is evidence of the mechanism that makes this fault break roughly every 161 years instead of every 500. The most reassuring thing about the Hayward Fault, the thing that looks like a slow leak rather than a bomb, is the reason it goes off as often as it does. And that reframes Thursday morning one final time. A magnitude 3.8 at 5 kilometers depth right around the transition between the creeping layer and the locked zone is not a fault venting pressure. It is a small failure in the exact region where the creeping section has been loading the locked patch for a century and a half. The energy it released was trivial. The place it released it was not. There is a further wrinkle in the aseismic release figure that is worth pulling out, because it explains why the range is as wide as 26 to 78% rather than a tighter number. Part of that release is not steady creep at all. It is post-seismic slip, the continued sliding that occurs in the weeks, months and years following an earthquake as the fault zone readjusts to the new stress configuration. After a rupture, the shallow section frequently slips more than it would have during the same interval of ordinary creeping, essentially catching up. Separating the steady background creep from this earthquake-driven afterslip, over a record that includes only one large event, is genuinely difficult, and the width of the published range reflects that honestly. The stress concentration at the top edge of the locked patch has a physical consequence you can look for in the data too. If the shallow section is sliding while the deep section is stuck, the region between them should be the most stressed part of the fault, and it should therefore produce more small earthquakes than the sections above or below it. That is broadly what is observed on creeping faults, a band of persistent microseismicity clustered around the transition depth where the sliding stops and the sticking begins. Thursday morning's earthquake was at approximately 5.2 kilometers. That is not a coincidence, and it is not a warning either. It is simply where earthquakes on this fault tend to happen, the depth at which the creeping section has been quietly transferring load onto the locked one for 157 years, producing a steady background of small failures along the boundary. Thursday's was one of them, marginally larger than most, felt by more people than most, and otherwise entirely characteristic of a fault doing exactly what this fault does. So what happens when the locked patch finally goes? That is not a matter of speculation. It has been modelled in more detail than almost any other natural disaster scenario in the United States, and the results have been published, and they have a name. Part 12. 800 dead, $82 billion. It is called Hayward. In 2017, the Geological Survey published a scenario study, Scientific Investigations Report 2017-5013, modelling in exhaustive detail what would happen if a magnitude 7.0 earthquake ruptured the Hayward Fault. It was not a prediction, and it was never presented as one. It was a planning tool, developed with dozens of partner agencies, engineers, emergency managers, utilities and researchers, built to answer a question that vague warnings cannot answer. Not whether this fault is dangerous, but specifically and concretely what breaks, where, in what order, and for how long. The name is a compound, Hayward, for the fault. Wired, for the observation that the modern Bay Area's dependence on interconnected networks, power, water, telecommunications, data, creates cascading failures that a 19th century city simply did not have available to it. Here is what the modelling produced. Approximately 800 deaths, approximately 18,000 injuries requiring treatment, more than 400 fires ignited principally by ruptured gas lines, direct property and business losses exceeding $82 billion, more than 77,000 buildings damaged, approximately 400,000 people displaced from their homes, and a disruption to the water supply lasting somewhere between 6 weeks and 6 months. I want to take those numbers one at a time, because a list like that goes by too fast and the individual figures deserve more than a moment each. 800 deaths. Set that against 1868's 30. The population has grown roughly 30-fold, so a naive scaling would predict around 900, which means modern building codes are doing enormous work. They are holding the death toll to roughly what pure population scaling would give, despite the enormous increase in the height, density and complexity of what has been built. Every retrofitted bridge, every hospital rebuilt to remain functional, every soft-story apartment building braced at the ground floor is embedded in that number. It could easily have been many times worse, and the reason it is not is decades of unglamorous regulatory work that nobody thanks anyone for. 18,000 injuries. This is the figure that emergency planners find most operationally frightening, more so than the fatalities, because injuries consume resources in a way deaths do not. 18,000 people needing medical care in a compressed window, in a region whose hospitals are themselves damaged, whose roads are blocked, whose ambulances cannot reach half the addresses they are called to. The medical system in the Bay Area does not have 18,000 units of surge capacity sitting idle. Nobody's does. More than 400 fires. This is the one with the historical echo, and it is not a subtle one. 1906 killed most of its victims by fire, not by shaking, because the earthquake broke the water mains at the same moment it started the fires. Hayward models the same coupling. Natural gas distribution lines shear at fault crossings, and in areas of ground failure, ignition sources are everywhere in a modern city, and the fire departments that would normally respond are dealing with blocked roads, damaged stations, and a water system that may not be delivering pressure. $82 billion in direct losses. That figure excludes the longer-term economic damage from business interruption, cascading through supply chains and from the extended displacement of workers. It is the direct number, and it is larger than the annual budget of most American states. 77,000 buildings damaged and 400,000 people displaced. 400,000 is roughly the population of Oakland. Imagine needing to house the equivalent of an entire major city, in a region that already has an acute housing shortage, with a fraction of the existing stock removed from availability at the same moment, and then the water, 6 weeks to 6 months. That last one is the figure that changes how people think about this scenario when they really absorb it, because water is not a convenience. A modern city can improvise around a great deal, but it cannot improvise around water. Firefighting requires it. Sanitation requires it. Hospitals require it. Every day without it in a metropolitan area of millions generates a public health problem that compounds. And there is a particular reason the Bay Area's water supply is so exposed to this specific fault, which is not a general statement about earthquakes damaging pipes. It is a statement about geometry, and it comes down to a single tunnel through the Berkeley Hills. But before we go there, one more thing about Hayward deserves to be said, and it is the thing that makes this scenario different from the general background hum of disaster warning that everyone has learned to ignore. Hayward is not a warning, it is a work order. The report was not written to frighten people. It was written so that specific agencies could identify specific vulnerabilities and fix them, and in a number of cases that is precisely what happened. The scenario exists to be made obsolete. Every retrofit completed, every redundant system built, every emergency plan exercised against these numbers makes the modelled outcome less accurate in the direction everyone wants. Which raises the question the rest of this video is going to sit with. The information is not missing. It has been published, quantified, mapped and costed to the individual building for nearly a decade. The Bay Area is not a region that lacks warning. It is a region that has more warning, in more detail than almost any population anywhere on Earth has ever received about a disaster that has not happened yet. The wired half of the name deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it is the part that makes this scenario different from a 1968 version of the same earthquake. The scenario models the failure of interconnected systems rather than individual structures. Telecommunications infrastructure, data centers, the fiber routes that carry them, and the electrical grid that everything else depends on are all treated as coupled, because they are. A building that survives the shaking intact is still unusable if it has no power, no water, no data connection, and no functioning transport to bring workers to it. The economic damage in a modern earthquake is dominated not by collapsed buildings, but by functional interruption of buildings that are still standing. Hayward also models what comes after the main shock rather than stopping at the moment the shaking ends. It includes an aftershock sequence, and aftershocks on a magnitude 7 main shock would themselves reach magnitudes in the 5s and low 6s. Earthquakes that would be major news on any ordinary day, arriving repeatedly onto a built environment already damaged and a population already displaced. Buildings weakened but not destroyed by the main shock are precisely the buildings that come down in aftershocks, which is why post-earthquake inspection and tagging becomes such an urgent bottleneck. The 400 fires figure interacts with everything else in the model, in a way that a bare number does not convey. Fires begin within minutes of the shaking. Water pressure is compromised at the same instant. Roads are blocked by debris and by the ordinary chaos of several million people trying to move at once. Fire departments are simultaneously responding to structural collapses with people trapped inside. The scenario's fire modelling is not a separate chapter that happens afterward. It is a set of demands arriving in the same hour as every other demand, competing for the same resources. So what has all that knowledge actually bought? In at least one case, the answer is remarkable. It cost $38 million, and it is buried in a hillside a few hundred feet from a tunnel full of commuter trains. Part 13. The Tunnel and the 750 feet. The East Bay Municipal Utility District supplies water to roughly 1.5 million people on the eastern side of San Francisco Bay. That water does not originate locally. It comes from the Mokelumne River in the Sierra Nevada, traveling across the Central Valley through a system of aqueducts, and to reach the customers on the bay side of the hills, it has to get through the Berkeley Hills. It gets through them via the Claremont Tunnel. The Claremont Tunnel is a water transmission tunnel driven through the hills, and it crosses the Hayward Fault, not near it, across it. The tunnel and the fault intersect, and they intersect at a point that carries an enormous fraction of the district's total supply. Engineers understood exactly what that meant. In a rupture, a strike-slip fault does not merely shake a tunnel, it offsets it. One side of the tunnel moves horizontally relative to the other, and a rigid concrete-lined bore does not survive being sheared. In the worst-case assessment, slip on the fault would sever the Claremont Tunnel, and severing it would cut water to an estimated 50 to 70% of the district's customers, roughly 800,000 people, for as long as 6 months. 800,000 people, 6 months, from one tunnel. So the district did something about it. Beginning in 2004 and completing in 2007, they built a bypass, a separate tunnel section, engineered specifically for the fault crossing, designed not to resist the offset because that is not possible, but to accommodate it. The design philosophy for a structure crossing an active fault is fundamentally different from ordinary seismic design. You're not trying to prevent damage. You're trying to ensure that when the ground moves several feet horizontally, the structure deforms in a controlled, predictable, repairable way, rather than collapsing and requiring months of excavation to even reach. The cost was approximately $38 million. That is, in the context of a metropolitan water system, a manageable sum, and it may be one of the highest return infrastructure investments made anywhere in California in the 21st century, because it converts a 6-month catastrophic supply failure for 800,000 people into a repairable disruption. Nobody will ever know precisely how many lives it saves, which is the permanent political problem with prevention spending, and it was done anyway. Now here is the detail that makes this section of hillside worth a video of its own. Approximately 750 feet from the Claremont Tunnel, running through the same hills, crossing the same fault, is the Berkeley Hills Tunnel, the twin-bore 3.2-mile rail tunnel that carries Bay Area rapid transit trains between the East Bay flatlands and the communities beyond the hills. It is the tunnel we talked about earlier, the reason every train in the system slowed down on Thursday morning. 2 tunnels, 750 feet apart, both crossing the most probable major earthquake source in the San Francisco Bay Area. One carries the drinking water for the better part of 1 million people. The other carries commuter trains full of passengers. That is the geometry of the Bay Area's exposure in a single image, and it is not an accident of planning incompetence, it is topography. There are only so many places to get through the Berkeley Hills, and the fault runs along those hills, so anything that crosses the hills crosses the fault. Water, rail, gas, power, roads. The fault does not lie beside the region's lifelines. It lies underneath the one place all of them have to pass through. The rail tunnel has been the subject of extensive engineering assessment, and the vulnerability is understood in the same terms as the water tunnel, rupture and offset rather than shaking. A tunnel is actually a relatively good place to be during ground shaking. Underground structures generally perform better than surface structures because they move with the surrounding rock rather than whipping around on top of it. The threat is not the shaking, it is the several feet of horizontal displacement that a magnitude 7 would put directly through the structure. And this, finally, is the answer to the small mystery from the beginning of this video. The question of why a magnitude 3.8, an earthquake that broke nothing and injured nobody, was enough to slow every train in the network. It was not caution about the shaking. It was an institution that knows exactly what it has built through, responding to a reminder that the thing it built through is active. The protocol worked. Trains slowed. Crews walked the track. Nothing was found because nothing had happened. Normal service resumed within the hour. The system did precisely what it was designed to do on a day when the design was never actually tested, and everyone went back to work. The engineering approach to a fault crossing is worth spelling out, because it is genuinely different from ordinary earthquake design, and it is one of the more interesting problems in civil engineering. For a normal structure, seismic design is about resisting shaking. You calculate the forces the ground motion will impose, you provide load paths and ductility so the structure can absorb them without collapsing, and you accept some damage in exchange for keeping people alive. The structure stays roughly where it was. At a fault crossing, that framing fails completely, because the problem is not force, it is displacement. When a strike-slip fault ruptures, the ground on one side moves horizontally past the other, potentially by a meter or more in a magnitude 7, and no amount of strength can prevent that from happening to a structure that spans the break. You cannot make a tunnel strong enough to hold 2 tectonic plates in place. The attempt would simply guarantee a more complete failure. So the design philosophy inverts. You accommodate the offset instead of resisting it. In practice, that can mean enlarging the bore substantially through the fault zone, so there is room for the lining to shift without the opening closing off. It can mean segmenting the lining with flexible joints so the structure articulates rather than shearing. It can mean using materials and backfill deliberately chosen to be weak and easily re-excavated, so that after the earthquake crews can dig the damaged section out and replace it in weeks, rather than reconstructing a collapsed tunnel over months. The goal is not zero damage. The goal is damage of a known kind in a known place that can be repaired on a schedule. There is a regulatory dimension to this as well. California's Alquist-Priolo Earthquake Fault Zoning Act, passed after the 1971 San Fernando earthquake, restricts construction of structures for human occupancy directly astride active fault traces and requires geological investigation before building in mapped zones. It is why you will not find new housing built directly across the Hayward Fault trace. It is also, notably, not retroactive. It says nothing about the enormous stock of buildings and infrastructure that was already there when it passed. Which brings us to the last and most difficult part of this story. Because the engineering has largely done its job, the scenario has been modelled, the tunnels have been assessed, and in one case rebuilt. The building codes have been written and enforced. The warning has been issued repeatedly at every level for decades. So why does none of it seem to land? Part 14. The explanations we reach for instead. Every time the ground moves under a major city, a predictable set of alternative explanations appears within the hour, and Thursday morning was no exception. I want to go through them, not to mock anyone who finds them plausible, but because each one is interesting for what it reveals about how people actually process a threat like this, and because dismantling them clears the ground for the far stranger thing that is actually going on. The first is the one we already handled. They downgraded it to keep people calm. We walk through why that does not survive contact with how magnitudes are computed. Automated solutions in seconds for speed, analyst-reviewed solutions later for accuracy, revisions in both directions, applied identically to earthquakes nobody feels in places nobody lives. But there is a psychological observation worth adding now that we have the full picture. The impulse behind that theory is not stupidity. It is a correct instinct attached to the wrong object. Something genuinely is being underplayed about the Hayward Fault. It is just not the magnitude. It is the fault itself, and the underplaying is not being done by any agency. We will get to who is doing it. The second is earthquake weather. This is a California folk belief with real staying power, and the version you hear most often holds that hot, still, oppressive days precede earthquakes. Some people report a specific quality of light. Others describe a stillness in the air. The belief is old. Versions of it appear in the ancient world, and it is genuinely widespread. There is no mechanism. Earthquakes nucleate kilometers below the surface, at depths where atmospheric conditions have no measurable physical influence. The pressure changes associated with even dramatic weather systems are trivial compared with the lithostatic stresses at seismogenic depth, and the statistical studies that have looked for correlations between earthquake occurrence and weather patterns have not found any that hold up. What earthquake weather really is, I think, is a memory artifact. People remember the weather on the day of an earthquake they experienced, because that day is burned in with unusual clarity. They do not remember the weather on the 10,000 days without earthquakes. California has a great many hot, still days, so the odds that any given earthquake lands on one are excellent. The pattern is real in memory and absent in the data, which is the signature of every folk correlation ever recorded. The third is animals, and with an epicenter a short distance from the Oakland Zoo, this one was guaranteed to appear. Here the honest answer is more interesting than a flat dismissal, because there is something real underneath it. Animals do frequently react before humans do, and the reason is straightforward physics. Seismic waves arrive in order. The P wave comes first, travelling at roughly 6 kilometers per second, and it is a compressional wave that is often felt as a sharp, quiet thump rather than as shaking. The S wave follows, slower and much more strongly felt. For an earthquake a few kilometers away, the gap between them is a second or two. For a more distant event, it can be tens of seconds. Many animals have better sensitivity to low-frequency vibration, and to sound in ranges humans do not register well. So an animal reacting to the P wave while a human is still unaware is entirely real, and it is the same principle earthquake early warning systems exploit. Detect the P wave, calculate, alert before the S wave arrives. But that is a phenomenon measured in seconds. It is not prediction. The claims that matter, animals behaving strangely for hours or days beforehand, have been investigated repeatedly and have not produced a reproducible signal. The core problem is that nobody defines strange behavior in advance. It gets identified retrospectively, after everyone already knows an earthquake happened, and retrospective pattern identification will find patterns in anything. The fourth is induced seismicity, the idea that human activity, particularly fluid injection, is causing or triggering these events. This deserves a serious answer, because induced seismicity is entirely real. Oklahoma's dramatic increase in earthquake rates over the past 15 years is a genuine, well-documented consequence of wastewater disposal into deep formations. Injecting fluid into a fault zone reduces the effective normal stress holding it shut, and faults that were stable can slip. But it does not apply here. The East Bay Corridor does not host the kind of large-volume wastewater injection operations associated with induced seismicity elsewhere. And more fundamentally, the Hayward Fault does not require any human explanation. It is a plate boundary structure, accommodating the relative motion of the Pacific and North American plates, and it has been producing earthquakes on a roughly 150-year cycle for far longer than anyone has been injecting anything anywhere. The Paleoseismic record predates industrial civilization entirely. There is a common thread running under all four of these explanations, and naming it explains why they keep reappearing no matter how often they are addressed. Every one of them offers a mechanism you can watch, weather you can feel, animals you can observe, an agency you can blame, industrial activity you can point at. They convert a threat that is invisible, silent, and operating on a timescale of centuries into something with a visible cause, happening on a human timescale that a person could in principle notice or act on. The real explanation offers none of that. Two plates are moving past each other at about the rate your fingernails grow. They have been doing it for millions of years. The friction on a fault surface several kilometers underground is holding until it does not, and there is no observable precursor, no responsible party, and no signal to watch for. That is a genuinely difficult thing for a mind to hold on to, and folk explanations are what fill the gap. The foreshock problem is the sharpest illustration of this, and it is worth restating from a different angle than we used earlier. People want Thursday's earthquake to mean something, and the category that would let it mean something is foreshock. But foreshock is not a property an earthquake has at the time it occurs. It is a label applied later, by people looking backward, once a larger event has given the earlier one a role in a story. On the morning it happens, every foreshock in history is indistinguishable from the thousands of small earthquakes that are followed by nothing, because there is no measurable difference between them. Which means the honest position about Thursday morning is one that offers no satisfaction in either direction. It was almost certainly not a precursor to anything. It also cannot be ruled out as one. And that unresolved state is precisely what the human mind is worst at sitting with, which is why it will be resolved for us by whichever narrative is most available. Either it was nothing, or it was a sign. Now, having cleared all of that away, I want to point at the alternative explanation that actually holds up, the one that is genuinely unsettling, that requires no cover-up, no suppressed data, and no one lying to anybody. The Bay Area has been told the truth about the Hayward Fault, completely and repeatedly for decades, and it has stopped working. Part 15. The warning that stopped working. Consider what is actually known about this fault, laid out in one place. The recurrence interval is published, 161 years plus or minus 65. The elapsed time is a matter of arithmetic, 157 years and 10 months. The characteristic magnitude range is established, 6.5 to 7.1. The 30-year probability is quantified, roughly 27 to 31% for the Hayward-Rogers Creek system, the highest of any fault in the region, inside a regional figure of about 72%. The maximum credible event has been bounded by the 2016 imaging work, a connected 118-mile system capable of a magnitude 7.4. The consequences have been modelled building by building: 800 deaths, 18,000 injuries, 400 fires, $82 billion, 400,000 displaced 6 weeks to 6 months without water. The lifeline crossings have been identified down to the individual tunnel, and at least one of them has been rebuilt at a cost of $38 million specifically to survive the offset. There is no missing piece. There is no research gap holding anyone back. This is not a case of scientists suspecting something and struggling to prove it. The Hayward Fault may be the most thoroughly characterized earthquake source in the United States, and everything I have just listed is public, free, and has been for years. And on Thursday morning, a magnitude 3.8, an earthquake that hurt nobody, broke nothing, and released roughly 1/35,000th of the energy of the event everyone is waiting for, was the biggest news in the Bay Area for about 4 hours. Then the train sped back up and it was gone. This is what I mean when I say the warning has stopped working. It is not that people are uninformed. It is that a warning which never stops being true eventually stops being heard. A hazard that has been elevated every single day of your adult life registers as background rather than as threat, because the human nervous system is built to respond to change, not to constants. Nothing in our wiring is designed to sustain alarm about something that is equally likely today, tomorrow, and in 19 years. Seismologists have a term for the resulting problem, and it is not a technical one. They call it the preparedness gap, the distance between what people know and what people do. And notice how the physics of this particular fault deepens the trap. If the Hayward Fault were locked and silent, no creep, no small earthquakes, nothing measurable happening, it might read as ominous. Instead, it moves constantly. It creeps at 3 to 9 millimeters a year. It bends curbs. It produces small earthquakes routinely. It is visibly, continuously active in a way that feels like a system releasing pressure, and we have spent this entire video establishing that this appearance is not merely misleading but exactly inverted, that the creep is associated with a shorter recurrence interval, not a longer one, and that the quiet sliding at the surface is loading the locked patch below rather than draining it. The fault presents as harmless while behaving as the opposite, and it does this every day for free in full view. So the reassuring version is always available. The ground moved a little and everything was fine. It moves a little fairly often, and everything is usually fine. Thursday morning was, in the most literal sense, another data point in favour of complacency. And the day after a fault produces a small earthquake with no damage is a day when it is easier, not harder, to believe that this fault is not the one to worry about. That is the trap. Not ignorance, not suppression. A fault whose ordinary behaviour is a continuous argument against taking it seriously. I do not have a satisfying resolution to offer, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. What is worth saying is that the small, unglamorous actions are the ones that actually move the number. Water stored, a bolt securing a water heater, a house tied to its foundation, an apartment building's soft first story braced, a plan for where a family meets when the phones do not work. None of that requires believing an earthquake is imminent. It only requires accepting that the interval is 161 years plus or minus 65, and that we are 157 years and 10 months into it. The 800 deaths in the Hayward scenario are not a fixed quantity. That number is an output of assumptions about the built environment, and the built environment is the one variable in this entire system that human beings actually control. The fault is going to do what the fault does. Everything else about the outcome is a choice made in advance, by people who will not know which specific choice mattered. There is a specific asymmetry in this situation that makes it worse, and it is the same asymmetry that undermines every kind of preventive work. When preparation succeeds, nothing happens, and nothing is a difficult thing to point at. The Claremont Tunnel bypass has, to date, prevented exactly 0 water outages, because the earthquake it was built for has not occurred. If the fault ruptures in 2040 and the bypass performs as designed, the outcome will be that several 100,000 people keep their water and never learn how close they came to not having it. The $38 million will have bought an absence. Failures, by contrast, are extremely legible. A collapsed structure is a photograph, an outage is a headline. So the entire incentive structure around preparedness runs backward. The successes are invisible, and the failures are vivid, and any individual deciding how much to worry about a fault is working from a sample dominated by things that went wrong somewhere else. Layer onto that the timescale problem. 161 years is longer than a human life. It is longer than most institutions retain memory. A person born in the Bay Area today has a reasonable chance of living their entire life without experiencing a Hayward Fault rupture, and also a very substantial chance of experiencing one. Both of those statements are true simultaneously, and there is no way to plan around one without accepting the other. That is the actual shape of living here. Not denial and not fear. A permanent low-grade uncertainty that resolves into either nothing or everything, on a schedule nobody controls, with a set of small precautions that cost very little and that most people will never need. On the 21st of October, 1868, the Hayward Fault broke the ground for 20 miles, from Warm Springs in the south to San Leandro in the north, and 30 people died in a region of 260,000. On the 13th of August, 2026, at 8:30 in the morning, that same fault produced a magnitude 3.8 2.5 miles from San Leandro in a region of 7.7 million, and the trains were back to full speed before lunch. The fault is not counting down to anything. It has no intentions and no schedule. It is simply a boundary between two pieces of the Earth's surface that are moving past each other at 5 centimeters a year and have never once stopped, and one day the friction holding the deep section shut will be exceeded, and everything bent over the previous century and a half will straighten out in about 10 seconds. Which leaves one question genuinely open, and it is not a rhetorical one. It is a thing that can be checked in the coming days by anyone who wants to watch. Those two aftershocks stayed in the same place. If, over the next week, the small earthquakes on this fault begin to step progressively along strike, appearing north toward Berkeley or south toward Hayward at increasing distances in sequence, that would be a different pattern than the one we saw on Thursday, and a considerably more interesting one. Watch the map, not the magnitude.